If you enter icing conditions in an aircraft with no known icing capability, you are an instant emergency aircraft. If those icing conditions continue all the way to the ground, your chances of survival are very thin. My name's Juan Brown. It is Tuesday, January 16th. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel, and I'm getting a lot of questions about the crash of November 252 Delta Lima, a 1975 Cessna 310, an aircraft by looking at this most recent photo with no known de-icing or anti-icing capability. That's a clean wing and a clean tail. No boots. From the Aviation Safety Network, Sunday, 14 January 2024, Cessna 310R by PLAC Holdings, November 252 Delta Lima, a 1975 Cessna 310. That would be the 310 with the IO 520 engines, naturally aspirated Continental six-cylinder engines. 3 fatalities, 3 occupants near Poolville, Texas. While on approach, the Cessna 310R twin-engine airplane, November 252 Delta Lima, was destroyed when it crashed near Poolville, Texas. The private pilot and 2 passengers, apparently tragically his 2 kids, were fatally injured. The flight originated from Carrizo Springs, Texas, and was destined for Bridgeport. Weather at the time of the accident, remember there's this large, cold area of weather just surrounding the central part of the country and reaching all the way down into Texas. METAR for the arrival airport. Winds 020 at 6 knots. Visibility 10 statute miles. So it's VFR. It's overcast at 3,000 feet with 10 miles visibility. So it's technically VFR down there. The temperature dew point spread is the temperature is minus 11 degrees Celsius and the temperature minus 21 degrees Celsius. Bridgeport is located just west of Dallas, and this crash occurred just west of Poolville, right about in this area here, where we've got towers reaching upwards of 1,400 feet and terrain in that area about 1,200 feet. MSL. The data here on FlightAware shows a relatively straight flight path right from his departure airport to his destination airport, and it looks so steady to me that it appears to me that I bet this aircraft was on autopilot almost the entire time. These spikes right here in the data, I just think they're anomalies in the data. 369 miles an hour on a spike, unlikely. Just big spikes in the data. So very consistent. Otherwise, 250, 260 mile per hour ground speed. And he chooses this cruise altitude, IFR cruise altitude of about 7,000 feet. Now there's a AirMet in the area for icing conditions from the surface all the way up to about 20,000 feet. And some pilot reports of light rime icing out of the Dallas area at about 4,000 or 6,000 feet. What we don't have is the any ATC audio tapes at this time about this flight or from this flight. And right about here, 40 or so miles from his destination, he begins his descent from his cruise altitude of 7,000 feet and does a very stable and steady straight ahead descent until he impacts the terrain. Now, the 310 is a slippery airplane. In Harvey, my 1959 model 310, I usually like to use 5 times the altitude. So if I'm at 7,000 feet and I want to get down to 1,000 feet for the airport, that's 6,000 feet. 6 times 5, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. That's 30 miles. I'll usually add another 5 miles to slow down. So 35 miles out, I would start planning on my descent. So this descent point is about on target for a descent to his destination. But if we look at the track log data, by the way, that descent of about 5 miles per 1,000 feet, that is a shallow descent. The whole idea why I use such a shallow descent is I'm trying to not shock cool the engines. I want to bring the engines back from their cruise power setting. Usually up at altitude, I like to be at 11,000 feet, wide open throttle, and then just bring them back to about at that cruise altitude on my airplane, that would yield about 20 inches of manifold pressure. I like to bring the throttles back to about 18 inches of manifold pressure and keep them at 18 inches of manifold pressure for my descent on in, which would yield about 500 foot per minute rate of descent in my case. And looking at his descent information here, he's got a very stabilized descent of about 500, but then it gets up to about 800 feet per minute. But the problem is he takes it all the way down to the terrain. Was this ice that was bringing him down, or was he trying to scud run in, get underneath a cloud deck? The cloud deck was reported at his destination to be at 3,000 feet. I just don't understand why the descent continues all the way down to 1,200 feet. He climbs up briefly to 400 feet or 1,400 feet, but eventually ends up impacting the terrain. So he takes the plane down right down to the tops of the trees. Is icing a factor here? It's going to be hard for investigators to tell because this is the sort of evidence that melts right away after the crash. The pilot in this case was a young surgeon, Dr. Heath Smith. So investigators will be looking at how long has he been flying, what's his ratings. It looks like, according to the Aviation Safety Network, he held just a private pilot's license. And then how much instrument time does he have? He's got to have an instrument rating to be flying in these sort of conditions. And how much 310 time? How much overall aviation experience does Dr. Smith have? Dr. Smith was not only a general surgeon, but a bariatric surgeon and also a member of the Paradise School Board. So just a huge loss for the local community. And the day following the accident, the weather cleared up and the weather was beautiful. Stay out of the icing conditions, especially in aircraft without any anti-ice or de-icing capability. Just having prop de-ice or pitot heat is not enough to keep you out of trouble in icing conditions. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.